The manhwa begins with a young lady who sobs quietly while sitting on her bed. She raises her head to find a man who comes in through the window. Kazan, she calls, quickly adjusting the bed curtain around them. He calls her name softly before placing a kiss on her forehead. He notes that they're running out of time, so he'll just get straight to the point. Almost immediately he reveals, "I heard a strange rumor. Are you really going to marry the king of Bahalan?" Trembling, she states that she's sure he already knows that she would surely leave the palace, otherwise she might die in her brother's hands. Kazan reminds her that she's to elope with him, since as long as they leave Parzion it'll be alright. However, she asks if he thinks it'll be possible. She remarks that they're powerless, and if her brother were to catch them eloping they'll face punishment worse than death. Kazan assures her that he wouldn't let that happen, but she declares that it's their best choice as long as she can guarantee his freedom. Kazan, feeling overwhelmed by the betrayal, proclaims that she'd mentioned she believed in him. "Was it all a lie? From the start, did you even believe in me?" He begins to take off his clothes, asking if it's because he's nothing but a lowly slave. He asks if that's why she had no intentions of eloping with him in the first place. However, she discloses that she doesn't blame him for resenting her. Holding her leg, he asks if she only wants that from him. Without waiting for an answer, he pushes her onto the bed, leaving her startled as she struggles to ask what he's doing. He buries his head in her neck, ignoring her plea not to do it there since they're in the palace. He demands to know why he can't, adding that he can do anything for her. "But why can't you do the same?" he asks, tears streaming down his cheeks. She begins sobbing, but as she reaches out to comfort him, the bed curtain is suddenly pulled back, exposing their compromising state. The man states with a smirk that he was sure at first, but it turns out the princess is really busy stuffing her face with a lowly slave. Her brother immediately orders that they be dragged out, and soon they are held away from each other while Kazan is whipped continuously despite her pleas for him to be freed. Her brother orders that he be thrown into the underground prison, where he will be put on trial as soon as the day breaks. "You lowly slave, I'm sure you'll get executed." Immediately she rushes after her brother and on her knees proclaims that she'll do anything for him to spare Kazan's life. At this moment, her brother looks back at her with a smirk, asking if she'll really do anything, even if it costs her everything. Hopeless, she raises her head and says, "Yes, even if it costs me everything, I want you to spare Kazan." In a new scene, her father, visibly annoyed, demands to know how she dared to send a marriage annulment letter to King Bahalan, asking if it's because of the slave. He kicks her to the ground while she confesses that she already has another man in her heart, while her father rants about how he'll have to give up all the good the old man had sent, all because of her. "Have you not come to your senses?" the king asks. However, her brother, who's been quiet, speaks and states that the princess who has tarnished the honor of Parzion must be punished. As a result, her father orders that she be locked in the East Tower, without access to anywhere else forever. Her brother's cruelty and her father's indifference weighed heavily on her, and she would be lying if she claimed she wasn't afraid to face the harsh reality, yet she still managed to smile because the only thing that brought a hint of spring to her cold, winter-like existence was the hope that she could save Kazan. As long as she could save him, she could find happiness in the most unhappy time of her life, however. Later they move on a horse while she asks her brother if Kazan is leaving safely. He replies that he's sure he's on his way already, but after looking around she expresses her concern that that isn't the way to the East Tower. Her brother turns to her and asks if she only just noticed, adding that she should say hello to her slave too. Her brother unsheathes his sword, and once she notices Kazan in the distance with his piercing red gaze, she calls out to him for the last time, with her voice trembling as she witnesses the death of the one she loved. In a new scene, she trembles as she pleads with her older brother, who holds up a bow and arrow, urging her to hurry up and choose before letting the arrow loose. The arrow that makes a cut on a slave's ear. However, her brother isn't satisfied. He proclaims that he'll spare the person she chooses. Her eyes set on Kazan, she goes down on her knees pleading with her brother to save all of them, promising that she'll never speak of him to their father anymore. calling the king father. Is it because the great empress's child is different? But wasn't the empress buried in the ground long ago? Her brother states. He raises the bowl again, asking if he was right. Determined, she declared that she'll stand in front of the target instead, and if he's angry he should take it out on her instead. Her brother welcomes the idea, proclaiming that playing with her is far more entertaining. The princess walks up to Kazan and Samra and asks that they take the people and leave, however Kazan contests it. Alona assures him that even if her brother kills the others he would never do that to her, so he should hurry and leave. Kazan tries to speak again, however Samra grabs his hand and recounts that the princess is helping them escape. The princess is right, Samra adds. Her brother, who is done setting up his bowl, orders that she stays still, stating that if she dies like that he wouldn't be able to take responsibility. As he releases the arrow into the air, she presses her eyes shut while Kazan frees himself from Samra's grip and pushes the princess to the floor, causing him to miss his shot. Her brother, provoked by the act of arrogance, grits his teeth in the distance while Kazan checks Alona to see if she's all right. Frightened, Alona turns to him demanding to know why he'd done that. She tells him he's only putting himself in danger, but he responds saying, "Because I made a promise, I promised to get you out of this palace safely, so, protecting you is my duty," he says as he arises. Alona slowly opens her eyes, reflecting on how it's the same dream again. She picks up a pen and writes in a book how long it has been since she dreamed of Kazan. "Maybe that's why even though I write in my journal every day, today feels a bit different," she writes. "It's been over 7 years since you died and I've been imprisoned in the tower. Life after my brother became king has been hell every single day. But the fact that you're not here has been even more painful for me," she writes. She also mentions how ever since the war with the Ashartra's kingdom began, her brother's torment has lessened, but a war with Gajan's Nada, it's too horrifying. She continues and adds that it's already been 3 years since the fighting started and a lot of her people and his friends have either been injured or killed. She apologizes for being so powerless that she couldn't protect either him or anyone else, hoping that the terrifying war ends soon because praying is all she can do. In a new scene, some knights celebrate the war being over and the victory of the kingdom of Ashartras over Parzion. They soon capture Alona and proceed to take her before the king of Ashartras for the punishment of a defeated nation. Silently she reflects on how it's been 7 years since he left and raises her head, happily thankful that she can now finally join him. They push the door open, and as she walks in she flinches at the sight of the fallen knights on the ground. Alona is thrown on her knees beside her brother, who appears excited by her presence. "Look, Alona is right here, alive and perfectly fine, so now, as promised, spare my life," he speaks. Hearing the king's voice ask if they'd made such a promise, Alona, hearing the voice sound familiar, raises her head for the first time since being brought before the presence of the king. The king then asks if he really thought himself worthy of making a deal with him, being the king of a defeated nation, with him the king of a victorious nation. Alona's eyes fill with tears now as she realizes that the person sitting on the throne is the one she believed to be dead 7 years ago, the man she always loved, Kazan. Excited, she calls his name while her brother yells, asking how he dares humiliate him and how he's still alive since he's sure he killed him with his own hands. Provoked, Kazan arises, asking if he dares mention that story, and as he approaches, he says he's just as stupid as he was then. Her brother calls him a filthy creature, however he only asks if he's forgotten, reminding him that Parzion has now fallen. "The filthy one is you," he says before plunging his sword into him. The king orders that his tongue be torn out and put in a cart before declaring that they will return to Ashartras, where he will then receive the choice of Sindar. As they pull him away, he calls out to Alona, who trembles on her knees. "Princess of Parzion, raise your head," Kazim declares. "Alona of Parzion, you will be judged for the defeat of your country and you deserve the death penalty. However, thinking of the suffering of my people, death is a luxury for you." Alona of Passion loses her right to be princess and, "The king of Ashartras, I order you to become a bed slave." He gives an order for her to be taken to his room and prepared, stating he will join her afterwards. Later she sits on the bed with a collar on her neck wondering if Kazan is truly alive, recalling how she'd held him in her arms. She questions how it is possible for a person who is dead to come back to life, and also not only that but as a king. Maybe it's not Kazan, she thinks, but if it is really Kazan. Tearfully she calls his name, however he asks why she has that expression, asking if it's strange for him to come in through the door because he always used to come through the window. She asks if it's really him, but he just states that she wishes it weren't him. She refuses and extends her hand forward, mentioning how much she'd wanted to see him again, and she just couldn't believe it. However, Kazan slaps her hand away without hesitation. With his piercing red gaze he orders that she takes her hand off as it's repulsive. Kazan tells her that when she'd found him he wondered what expression she would have, but she's still repulsive. Alona asks why he would say that, however he asks that she keeps her mouth shut and explains what she has to say. He tells her he can no longer take it anymore, and as she looks confused, he asks if she thinks he doesn't know anything. I know why you did that night 7 years ago. With his grip firm around her arm she asks what he means, but he asks that she stops pretending. Swiftly he pushes her onto the bed and remarks that they fulfill their roles. He leans in and kisses her, while ignoring her pleas for him to stop. Kazan, wait, it seems there's a misunderstanding, we should talk more, she manages to utter, however his response remains cold. Ripping her dress off, he says he should have told her, "You are my slave and I don't listen to the words of a slave." He adds that perhaps because she's been a princess for too long she isn't aware, however he's going to properly educate her. "I'm going to teach you what the role of plunder is," he finishes. As she gasps for air underneath him he calls her name and asks if she knows how long he's awaited this moment. He tells her he'd spent hundreds and thousands of nights thinking and thinking again to destroy her country, kill her kin, and to make her his slave the moment she walks into that room. Again she begs him not to do that, but he only asks why, stating that it's not like it's the first time with him. Again she asks him to stop, but he only orders that she looks at him properly. "I've always wanted to have you here, in your own room, because you didn't allow me to hold you." With unsteady breaths, she finally tells him she doesn't like it. However, he dismisses her words, urging her not to lie and adding that her body is telling him she wants him. Lost in her thoughts, she thinks she doesn't want it like that. "Kazan never treated me like this," she thinks as she reflects on how he would always mention that he loved her. The Kazan of now, he feels like a completely different person. "Still, I'm glad you're alive, Kazan." As their lips connect this time, she recalls how there was something she'd wished for every day for 7 years, which was to be in his arms again, and although his appearance has changed a little, the most important thing is the fact that they have met again. The next morning when she opens her eyes she thinks, since he's misunderstanding her now there's nothing she can do, but if he listens to her story, he will surely return to the old Kazan. Later, she's thrown roughly into the carriage with her 2 hands chained. The knights question why a slave woman would be given a cart, while she questions if that is how they are going to a Chartres. Recalling how she'd heard about a Chartres being a very hot and barren land, she worries about what'll happen to her if she goes there. She tries to get up, however the activity from last night left her leg feeling numb. "Kazan, you've never pushed me this hard before," she thinks when suddenly she hears a loud noise outside of her cart. She heard the guards outside discuss why the king wouldn't just kill her right away, mentioning how many Chartres the Parzians had killed without mercy. They conclude that if she's to step on their lands, their fallen countrymen will wail in sorrow, and as a hand slowly opens the door, he asks if they shall just deal with her by themselves. They walk into the cart and after observing her they ask if that is why the king is taking her as a slave. "Ha, what's the use of a pretty face, just remember this woman is a passion. My cousin was dragged away as a slave and killed, this is revenge for the Chartres who suffered and died in Parzion," he says, holding his sword, ignoring her pleas for mercy. "Beg for mercy in the afterlife," the knight retorts before raising his sword high in the air, intending to end the Parzion bloodline once and for all. Almost at the brink of death, she reflects on how she's only just met Kazan, and as his sword draws closer she presses her eyes close, calling for Kazan in her quietly when a voice coldly asks, "Do you want to die?" How dare you try to invade my territory? He immediately drops his sword to the ground, trembling in front of the king, and without any regard to his explanation, the king ends his life on the spot. Alona trembles in the corner when a strong force pulls the chains binding her forward. Kazan grabs her jaw, and after observing her for a while, he lets go, commenting that there appears to be no injuries. He turns to the man behind him and orders that he moves Alona to the carriage, keeping her close to him and also placing guards to ensure no one approaches. Make sure the surveillance is strict, he orders as he walks away. In a new scene, they announce crossing the Ashartras border and decide to camp on the spot. A lady approaches Alona and firmly orders her to come out, stating that the king has summoned her. As she steps out of the carriage, she can't help but feel the warmth of the soft sand beneath her feet. The lady who notices turns around and asks why she isn't following and also what she's waiting for, but Alona apologizes. Do you know who the person you serve is? It's the king of Ashartra, chosen by the god of Sindar. The lady finishes. Hearing this, she reflects on the past conversations between her and Kazan. He'd mentioned that in Ashartras not anyone could become king, and to become king, one needed to be chosen by a god. He explained further that their kingdom was one where magic and gods coexist. Kalima, the goddess of earth and strength, Zahira, the goddess of fire and wisdom, Lu, the goddess of water and life, Sindar, the god of wind and death, and the one who becomes king is chosen by either one of these gods, and then the king can wield the power of that god. He further explained that because there is a king who receives the blessings of the gods even in the barren desert country, the people never lose hope. He told her then that due to the years-long war for the throne, the inhabitants of Ashartra are being taken to other countries and suffering. Sensing his worries, she'd remarked that someday she'd like to visit his country, and he'd agreed, saying once the civil war was over they would visit Ashartra. The lady tells Alona that it's unpleasant, but a lady like her enjoys the glory of serving the king, but since it's the will of the gods she should do it with all her heart. The king is the only person who survived the curse of the gods. She pushes Alona into a room and orders her to change and go out. Alona, holding the dress up, slips out of her dress, but when she turns her head, she notices a scorpion's tail and panics. Recalling the words of how Ashartras animals could be poisonous, despite being frightened, she reaches for a bowl and drops it precisely on the animal, trapping it inside. Later, she takes Alona to the presence of the king, who orders her to leave sharply, however she hesitates. His sharp gaze drives her to a quick reconsideration as she exits sharply. Kazan, noticing her thorn dress, asks if maybe someone had attacked her. She explains that an animal was inside her dress and she got it dirty trying to avoid it. The king then remarks that it could have been dangerous and yet she avoided it, and she replies that he told her himself that Ashartras animals could be poisonous. Grateful, she thanks the king for saving her from the knights. However, he retorts coldly, "Save you?" Loosening her dress, he tells her she's very mistaken. "It wasn't that I saved you, it was that I punished them for touching what was mine. Someone like you with such high value is rare." Alona, already fed up with his mistreatment, asks the reason why he's so angry at her. She asks if perhaps it is because of that incident on that particular night 7 years ago. Is it because of the things I said when I went to find you?" Alona asks. 7 years ago, while Kazan was imprisoned, Alina had gone to find him. Newly formed hope sparked in him as he spotted the presence of the one he loved, asking if he was all right. He assured that it was all right and went ahead to ask if her brother had hurt her. He reached for her face, however she turned away and stated that she'd come there because there was something she needed to inform him. As she clenched her fist hard, she disclosed that she'd been lying to him all those while. He reached for her wrist, confusion evident as he asked if she was okay, however she suddenly grew cold, pulling away from his grip. Confused, he called her name, but her response caught him off guard as he spoke something unexpected, revealing that she had never loved him, not even for a moment. She'd told him it honestly never made sense, remarking that how could a princess ever love a slave like him? Not convinced, he asked why she was saying hurtful things like that, and maybe it was because of her brother, but she exclaimed, saying no, and those were her true feelings. She further disclosed how she never believed they could ever run away together, not to mention trusting him. Just like that, her last words to him on that memorable night as she turned away were, "So if he were to ever survive by any chance, he should never come looking for her again. I never want to see you." In the present day, she explains that he might not believe her, but her brother had forced her to say it as punishment for sending a marriage annulment letter to King Bahalan, and in addition, if she'd stayed locked in the tower and pretended to be dead, he promised to save him. Alona reflects on how that night her brother had watched her in the corner. "If you want to save the slave, then end things with him. You never know when you two knights get close again. I don't ever want to see that disgusting scene again." Alona tells him that if he was alive they might be able to meet again, but if she didn't break things off with him he threatened to not save him. However, she stops when she realizes her explanation isn't getting through to him, as his gaze appears cold. "Kazan, you don't believe me, do you?" she asks calmly. Kazan, however, turns away and asks if she knows how he became a Chartres king. Gripping her collar, he reveals that it was fueled by his hatred for Parzion. Overlapping the chains around her wrists, he continues, "For passion's king, and especially. I became king because I hated you most of all." Refusing to back down, she retorts that everything she did was to protect him, but he interrupts, asking if she would believe such a claim if their positions were reversed. Without waiting for her response, he throws her onto the couch. "If you're going to act like an invader, then do it properly." He takes a bottle, and as he opens it he remarks that if she continues like that he wouldn't be able to help her. "I have no choice but to uncover your weakness myself," he finishes. Alona asks what he means, and he explains that she may be a premium bedchamber slave, but she's far too frail, and just that little bit of excitement her body already seizes up. "At this rate I wouldn't even be able to hold you." He slides his hand slightly downward, testing her reaction, and it works as she pleads with him to stop, but he ignores her, asking if she truly doesn't want that. He then leans in closer with his breath warm against her skin, before he pulls back abruptly. "There it is," he says, "your weakness." She pleads again for him to let go, but he declines. "I enjoy seeing this expression of yours, that defeated look in your eyes. That's exactly what I desire." Tears well up in her eyes as she realizes her words aren't reaching him, and with one final plea, she whispers, "Please, don't say that. Don't make me hate you." He only smirks as he calls for someone outside to fetch him another bottle of scented oil and a camp bed. The lady, noticing Alona, asks if he plans to use the oil on the slave girl, but he only asks, "What if he does?" She explains that it is an invaluable magic item, one which the emperor uses to ease his mind, and he retorts that the slave exists to ease his mind also, so he's using it as it is meant to be used, and she doesn't need to concern herself. In a new scene, they finally arrive at the capital of Chartres. Perma and the citizens all hail the king as he passes. Alona in a carriage peeps outside to get a view of the stunning city that has now become wealthier than Parzion. She reflects on how the journey to the capital wasn't easy, but she got to learn a few things. She learned the tattoo on Kazan's arm represents divine protection, and the Sindar's oracle her brother received is just like the executions Kazan carries out on prisoners. As she tried to understand why people seemed particularly terrified of divine retribution, a stone flies in her direction and she hears the people protest. "Death to Parzion, I can't accept this. Return my child, let's drag her out and make her pay for the pain our people have suffered." She heard the people screaming for help, and it isn't until she hears the screams of the children that she slams herself against the carriage, forcing the lock to come off. She gets out and a person soon calls out to her for help. She goes over to the man and the people soon notice her and proclaim, "She's here, there's another Parzion woman, kill her." She directs the boy into the carriage, and when he gets on she asks about the children, and he tells her they're not there. He explains that when they arrived in the capital the king took them, and she thinks Kazan must have evacuated them in advance. Just as they're talking, she notices from the corner of her eye, a man grabs a rock presuming to slam it hard against her head, but he misses his shot thanks to the Grand General who appears. He proclaims that those people have been chosen by Sindar, and Sindar in his wisdom grants them divine power to soothe their anger, so let's all lessen all wraths. The people go calm now, cheering gratefully while the Grand Commander checks on Alona. She reports that she's okay, and he coldly orders the person in the carriage to get out. Alona pleads, explaining that he's injured. However, the Grand Commander retorts that those people are condemned. Ashartra shows no mercy to them. Later, a person hands her medicine and discloses that the victory will begin soon, so she should stand straight and wait. Once he leaves, she reflects on the injured boy she'd helped into the carriage and without hesitation tries to slip out, but a man appears and asks where she believes she's heading to. She notices it's Kazan and he's fully dressed, and while the others greet him he asks if she's so foolish to the point where she can't grasp her situation, wander around and you'll end up in trouble like before. She tells him she's witnessing the people losing their lives and she wants to do something, however he just calls her pathetic. You can't even protect yourself and yet you think you can protect others. A defeated nation's princess can do nothing. He tells her what had happened earlier was a kind of execution and they were already condemned to die, but because she intervened, she made the princess of Parzion unforgettable to everyone. Isn't that a good thing for you? Don't you wish more than anyone for me to die painfully? She asks. However, he snatches the medicine from her hand, stating that she stops talking nonsense. My revenge isn't about killing you, he says as he applies it onto her cut. It's about keeping you by my side, suffering for the rest of your life. He turns away and says there will be another execution soon, and if she steps in like before, she should remember even he wouldn't be able to help her. Later, she stands beside the king holding a jug, thinking of how everyone gathered were celebrating the fall of Parzion. Lost in thought, she thinks, no matter how little I enjoyed as princess, to them, I'm just the Parzion princess who must atone for her sins, whether in passion or here am I destined to live as an outcast? Kazan calls her name and she proceeds to fill his cup. You'll face situations ahead that will be hard to endure, but if you collapse here it'll be a problem. Whether it's a misunderstanding or the truth, if you die you'll never get to hear it, he finishes. As she tries to understand what he meant by that, they announce the appearance of the Oadisha family. Alona by his side questions if his statement meant he's willing to hear her out. She thinks she's come so far to meet Kazan, so it's too early to give up yet. The Chancellor Harnuk Padisha pays his greetings to the king, and also the court steward Rid Padisha pays her greetings also. The Chancellor congratulates him on the fall of Parzion, however he remarks that it's too early to celebrate just yet. The Chancellor then states that since the country is more stable it's about time for him to take a queen, explaining that though the war was the reason, it's been 4 years without a queen and it would be improper not to consider an heir. The Chancellor then advised that a lady who has long served him loyally and is well acquainted with him would be suitable, for example, someone like his daughter who has assisted him since the Civil War. His daughter states that she is always ready to dedicate herself to the royal family. She continues and expresses that if he grants her the opportunity to serve him from greater proximity she will dedicate herself even more wholeheartedly. Looking down at her he comments that it's such an interesting proposal and states that if she wishes to serve from a closer proximity, he will make it so. As Irid is about to thank him for his understanding he announces that he shall arrange quarters for her within the palace itself so she can fulfill her duties from a closer position. Looking visibly let down, she still thanks the king before asking if he hasn't shown too much leniency towards the Parzion woman. People are calling for her head. I heard even the execution date hasn't been set yet. Why not conduct it during today's victory celebration? Nothing would grace the feast more than the blood of a criminal. The king pours his drink into his mouth before replying that the woman is no longer a princess but his slave. The Chancellor tries to argue bringing up customary practice, however the king replies that if they're to talk about customs, should he not be the first to be executed for usurping but the Chancellor quickly disagreed, claiming that isn't what he meant. The Chancellor explains that politically she's useless if kept alive, and the king informs them that he has his reasons, so the matter of her disposal shouldn't be brought up any further. They agree and the Emperor announces that they begin the celebration. As the drums roll, a man is brought in and when Alona looks up she realizes it's her brother. He's thrown on his knees and the king signals for them to stop the drums as he walks down. From this moment, the Sindar's choice shall commence, he declares. Antonio departs Ion, may the gods have mercy on you. He makes a cut on his palm and drops the blood precisely on Antonio, who appears terrified. The judgment has begun, just as I expected, the emperor says. Ilona watches in confusion, questioning why her brother is wailing so much with no one physically torturing him, almost as if he's seeing something. Silently he begs to be spared, while the king retorts that his vile soul is not even worthy of leaving his body. Begone, he says as he places his hand on his head, and in an instant his body dissolves into thin air, vanishing without a trace. Just now Lord Sindar has taken the soul of the enemy to hell. True vengeance has been completed, so let us all raise our glasses in celebration, the king declares. Ilona in the corner covers her mouth in terror. Realizing that her brother had disappeared into thin air, she questions since when Kazan had gotten such abilities. The chancellor from the distance exclaims that it's truly incredible power, stating that from the first time he'd laid eyes on him he sensed he was someone extraordinary. They all appear interested in the story, and he proceeds to tell how 7 years ago, during the civil war, Lord Sindar approached their mercenary group concealing his identity, but due to his unmatched bravery they already knew he was the young prince. He explains that Lord Sindar desired to become king and he found himself filled with doubts, but at that moment, his daughter, Irid, recognized his true potential and firmly insisted that they support him. He discloses that that was how they'd fought against the first prince, giving rise to what everyone knew as the day the curse was challenged. The people remark that they would never forget the thrill of that day, questioning who would have thought that the seventh prince, seemingly insignificant, would turn out to be someone capable of evading even the curse of death, an immortal. Ilona, standing by his side, questions if he really was a prince of Ashartra and also an immortal like they'd claimed. The king, sensing her gaze, asks if she holds a grudge against him. Her hand trembling, she asks who he really is, however he only calls for Irid to take the slave to the MANHWA palace. Irid reminds him that the palace was built for the queen, but he retorts that it's now empty and it's the closest place to his bedchambers. But letting a mere slave, Irid, argue, however the king asks if she expects him to walk long distances each night without having laid with a woman. Irid doesn't back down and instead brings up the matter of etiquette, while the king gazes at her strongly as he repeats, "Etiquette?" Irid apologizes and declares that as the palace administrator she would ensure that the slave stays in the MANHWA palace under strict supervision. Later, as they walk to the MANHWA palace, Ilona asks what they meant by the day the curse was challenged. "Yes, I suppose you should know the master you serve, however." Irid strikes her in the face and states that a slave must learn through punishment. She grabs her jaw, calling her insolent. She insults her pale face, saying it appears there's no trace of life in it. She grips onto her jaw tightly that Ilona winces in pain, however she doesn't let go and instead states that with such worthless appearance why would Sindar like someone like her? "If you were my slave you would have been," she says when she hears the king ask if she was going to kill her. Irid immediately denied ever having such thoughts, however the king replies that given the context it could only be perceived that way. Looking at the mark on Ilona's face, he declares, "Irid Padisha, you must know that incompetence in Ashartra is a grave sin." She responds that she's aware, and he asks what should be done to the court official who'd harmed his slave. She goes down begging for forgiveness, while the king, with his hand on her shoulder, retorts that he hopes she recalls how to handle the king's property properly. "Training is something I want to keep as my own little pleasure," the king finishes, and she responds that she will remember. Irid ends up taking her to the bathroom. She informs her that no one will attend to her, so it's up to her to wash herself and come out on her own. Relieved to finally be on her own, she steps into the bath thinking, "You just truly be the son of a god, who would have known that the seventh prince was immortal." "Do you resent me?" she asks, but concludes that perhaps he'd never opened his heart to her from the beginning. She sobs quietly, wondering what she was doing everything for when she hears a person's footstep approaching. Kazan tells her he really can't bear to listen, while she gets up thinking he must have come to spend the night again. She asks him to leave, stating that she really can't bear to see him anymore that day, while he retorts that it seems it was all a lie, mentioning how she'd stated she wished to clear up any misunderstandings with him. Ilona immediately tells him that isn't true, remarking that she no longer knows who he is anymore. "Did you really love me?" She asks why he didn't mention anything to her about the fact that he was a prince and that he's immortal. "Why did you hide it from me?" She remarks that even though she was nothing but a powerless princess, if he had at all mentioned it to her, they would have gone down a different path. "A different path," he says with a scoff. Kazan then asks if she'd know he was a prince, she would have eloped with him or maybe saved him from that prison. He then asks if she knows that whether he was a prince or not, she could have had both, but since she was involved with a slave like him, there was no need to risk her life, but still he'd given her the last chance, and the one who ended up throwing it away was her. He pushes her into the bath. "Ilona, you asked me what happened to me during those 7 years. I wandered through blood-stained battlefields, repeating slaughter and destruction, that I even deleted my brother's neck with my own hands. It took me a lot of effort to get where I am now, but do you know what made it harder for me than all of this? It's you, Ilona, so accept the price," he finishes before kissing her. However, she asks him to stop claiming that she isn't ready yet. "Spread your legs properly, you're just a slave who must do as told." He whispers into her ear, revealing that ever since she betrayed him, a day didn't go by where he didn't long for her. As tears form in her eyes, she can only ask him to stop, in her head reflecting on the intense pressure that made her feel like losing consciousness. "You asked if I loved you, and that part is the truth without any lies. I clearly remember those feelings, just as much as I loved you back then, but I hate you now," he ends. 12 years ago in Parzion, her brother had brought her along with him outside. She turned her head and found a lady with a collar feeding sweet to a man, and out of curiosity asked her brother what kind of place that was. Just as he was about to respond, a person thanked for coming and announced that there were so many items to look forward to. The first item was a countryside girl from a Chartres who was only 17. Her brother replied that it was a slave auction house, saying all the high-quality slaves in the palace were bought from there. She'd asked her brother if their father hadn't demanded that he stop buying slaves, but he just ignored her question, saying that she'd requested to go out of the palace, so he brought her, so why was she questioning everything? He threatened to leave her behind, and she apologized. Just like that, everyone bidded to buy the 17-year-old girl, with everyone anticipating the next item to be sold, leaving her with a feeling of hate for the place. Finally, they brought out the last item, a young boy with rare red eyes from across the entire continent, the highest quality a Chartres boy. She avoided his gaze, begging him not to look at her, as she wasn't like the others in the place. Her brother soon noticed and assumed she took a liking to the young boy and attempted to bid for him, but an explosion caused an uproar. She clung desperately onto her brother with the entrance, which was now blocked, but luckily they had a back entrance. Her brother with no hesitation pushed her aside, and as she called for him to wait, she noticed the slave boy still in his cage. She rushed to him and grabbed the keys, sending them into his cage, but before she could return, a pillar dropped on her gown, causing her to get stuck, and as the building began to collapse and her eyes flashed before her eyes, the slave boy surprisingly took the hit for her. The next time she opened her eyes, she felt a warm substance drop onto her face, and when she realized it, she saw the slave boy covered in blood on top of her. With one push, he got the block off his back and took her in her arms, advising her to hold on tightly as he was going to run fast. Ilona sits on her bed, reflecting on how it had been almost 10 years since she had that dream. Kazan was so sweet then, but now so cold that she couldn't even recall how she'd fallen asleep. She steps out into her balcony, observing the beautiful scenery until she hears a person exclaim in pain. She takes a closer look, and the man introduces himself as Aslan. He asks if she's Alina of Passion, the king's slave. She asks how he knew, but he only responds asking if there's anyone in a Chartres who isn't aware of her existence. Aslan apologizes for being rude, stating that he'd only come to confirm something. "I really wanted to see you," he ends. She moves her hand, asking why he would want to, and gets a cut, but when he offers to call a healer, she declines, saying no one would want to treat a slave anyway. Aslan then offers to treat her, explaining that there's a corner in the corridor away from prying eyes. Could you come with me for a moment? She goes down to him and brings out a bag, remarking that since he's been to the temple he has collected various herbs. She asks if he's a priest and he says yes in a way. He helps her heal the cut without removing the fabric she placed to help stop the bleeding, and she thanks him. Aslan retorts that he wishes he could have used better medicine, but the temple was unfortunately too poor to offer more help. Curious, she asks if a temple can be poor, and he replies saying maybe not others, but the temple he serves dedicated to Lu is. He adds that they're hated by Lord Sindar, however she comments that they appear to be experiencing the same issues. Placing his hand firmly on her shoulder, he tells her the surrounding circumstances might make things difficult for her moving forward, but please don't give up, you have the strength to overcome any adversity. Alona thanks him for his kind words of reassurance while he suggests that he returns, as if the king were to find them together he would be furious. As she watches him leave, he asks that she doesn't be too sad, stating that they'll meet again. Later, the king notices the cloth wrapped around her arm, and just as he's about to question her, a person announces the presence of the third prince of the kingdom of Ether. He greets the king, congratulating him on his victory in the war, and also discloses that they offer tributes and maidens. The chancellor, seeming interested, asks where they are, and the man reveals that they await his presence outside the door. But Ashartra refuses maidens, considering the suffering my people endured as slaves. It is a sin, the king states. However, the chancellor states that offering maidens has been a tradition of vassal states, but the king only asks if they shouldn't break flawed traditions. It proclaims that if greed blinds them and leads them to commit sin like those of passion, they would face the same punishment as they did. The prince accepts, and as Alona observes them she questions what kind of life Kazan has led. He seems to be a better king than my brother, even if he's harsh to me, only me. The people's attention is soon drawn towards the god of water and life, the priest of the Lu temple, that approaches. He discloses to the king that although he's forbidden his visit, he has defied his order due to a critical matter. He reveals that he had a dream the previous night, however the king's voice is cold as he reminds him that he'd mentioned he had no interest in his dreams. Are you really not curious about the future of your highness and Alona of Parzion? He asks. Soon murmurs fill the room, with the people questioning what could be happening with the king. Aslan proceeds to pay his respects, stating that if he seeks advice about the two futures he should visit the Lu temple directly. I will be waiting for you there, your majesty. Ah, and a little more of her, please take care, he ends. Later, Kazan pulls her into a room asking if Aslan had healed her hand. As she struggles to speak, he tells her she should have informed him if she met someone. I'll call the therapist right away, make sure to treat it properly until it gets better. If you feel sick in the future, tell me, don't get involved with Aslan again. Kazan finishes. She mentions how he'd spoken about seeing their future, and Kazan tells her he only deceives with his sly tongue and is the kind of guy who makes one trust him and then betrays them. Kazan sharply retorts that knowing the future will change anything anyways, however she insists on finding out, stating that even if it's a very trivial future she wants to know. Why do you want to know? Are you going to betray me again? Kazan asks with a sharp tone. Reaching for him with her shaking hand, she says no, explaining that she's only worried about him. She proceeds to ask him why he no longer trusts her, mentioning how they'd loved each other so much, however he grabs her hand saying no. I believed in you until the very end, the words you said to break up in prison that day, because I thought it was a lie. Seen years ago on that night, Samra had come to check on him. He asked her not to worry about that, noting that he was already waiting. She asked how he knew she would come, and he responded that he thought she would at least come by to say goodbye. He mentioned to her how Alona had come to see him and said she never loved him. He stated that Alona was not that kind of person, and it seemed like she was being threatened by Antonio. He asked him to pass a message to Alona, but Sanra had contested it, saying it wasn't the time to worry about someone else since he would be executed by dawn. He asked him not to worry about him, saying he already planned the escape, and asked that they meet outside at midnight that day. He'd mentioned that if he told Alona it was the usual meeting place she'll know, and if they meet safely, the three of them together will leave to a Chartres. Samra had agreed to do it, and when he thanked her she stated that it wasn't because of someone else and instead it was because it was the order of a noble person claiming she will be loyal with him until they reach a Chartres. Samra had noted how the princess was under surveillance at the moment and he'd suggested she use the shortcut connected to Alona's room, adding that it wouldn't be that dangerous. Lastly, Samra had stated that she would ask the princess a favor before leaving. Later, a knight kicks his cell asking if he was the one who had been hanging around the princess, how it was, saying her figure is a work of art. Kazan had grabbed him and held him in a headlock for as long as it took him to grab the keys. Once he got the keys, Amara arrived with a paper and as her hand trembled she reported to the prince that Alona had betrayed them by telling the king that he had assaulted her, and it was shared that they requested execution. He asked where she'd gotten the document and she replied that Mr. Xerox had passed it to her saying he wanted to help the prince escape. Reflecting on how Mr. Xerox was like a father to him, he figured he wouldn't lie and dismissed the betrayal, thinking the document must have been manipulated and it must have been a scheme of Antonio, so he couldn't help but question what he'd gained by falsely accusing Alona now. He turns to Samra and asks if she told Alona to come out at midnight, and she mentions that she'd done so. Then I should go meet Alona as planned. Sending a forged document means she is in danger, he detailed. He asked that they wait for her until midnight, but Samra wasn't convinced and asked what if it's true, stating that she was a woman who even tried to marry another man, already betrayed him once, but he interrupted, asking her to stop the unnecessary doubts and move quickly as he couldn't keep Alona waiting. Like that he believed her until the end. But the one waiting for me was you who came with Antonio. When morning came I was revived, but Samira was carelessly abandoned on the cold ground, Kazan says. He asks if she knew how he felt when he made the child's grave with his own hands, the kid that tried her best for them until the end ended up dying because of him, because he foolishly believed in her. Alona argues that she didn't know about that and she was only carelessly dragged away by her brother, but Kazan, growing impatient, exclaims that two people had died because of her betrayal. How long are you going to lie? Alona tells him it's not a lie as she explains that Santa did pass some paper to her, but she wasn't aware of its contents as it was taken away immediately. I swear I did not wish for your execution at the trial, instead I wanted to risk everything to save you. I proved my love for you that way, she says with tears already pouring down her eyes. Kazan, now realizing something, asks if she meant to say Xerox had tampered with the documents. However, she only states that all she knew was that her brother said he was going to the tower and took her with him, and it's just that she cut him down in front of him. Just to save you, I have no other sin than throwing away my life, truly, that's all, Alona finishes. Thank you so much guys for 2,000 subscribers. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and also don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Bye for now.